Chapter 1. Origins of a Philosophy. To understand any disciplined approach to investment, it is first necessary to understand the objective for which the methodology is designed. For any part of the funds supervised by Fisher & Company except for funds temporarily in cash or cash equivalents awaiting more suitable opportunities, it is the objective that they be invested in a very small number of companies that, because of the characteristics of their management, should both grow in sales and more importantly in profits at a rate significantly greater than industry as a whole. They should also do so at relatively small risk in relation to the growth involved. To meet Fisher & Company standards, a management must have a viable policy for attaining these ends with all the willingness to subordinate immediate profits for the greater long-range gains that this concept requires. In addition, two characteristics are necessary. One is the ability to implement long-range policy with superior day-to-day performance in all the routine tasks of business operation. The other is that when significant mistakes occur, as is bound at times to happen when management strives for unique benefits through innovative concepts, new products, etc., or because management becomes too complacent through success, these mistakes are recognized clearly and remedial action is taken. Because I believe I best understand the characteristics of manufacturing companies, I have confined Fisher & Company activities largely to manufacturing enterprises that use a combination of leading-edge technology and superior business judgment to accomplish these goals. In recent years, I have confined Fisher & Company investments solely to this group because on the few occasions when I have invested outside it, I have not been satisfied with the results. However, I see no reason why the same principles should not be equally profitable when applied by those with the necessary expertise in such fields as retailing, transportation, finance, etc. No investment philosophy, unless it is just a carbon copy of someone else's approach, develops in its complete form in any one day or year. In my own case, it grew over a considerable period of time, partly as a result of what perhaps may be called logical reasoning and partly from observing the successes and failures of others, but much of it through the more painful method of learning from my own mistakes. Possibly the best way of trying to explain my investment approach to others is to use the historical route. For this reason, I will go back into the early, formative years, attempting to show block by block how this investment philosophy developed. The birth of interest. My first awareness of the stock market and the opportunities which changing stock quotations might make possible occurred at a fairly early age. With my father the youngest of 5 and my mother the youngest of 8, at my birth I had only one surviving grandparent. This may have been one of the reasons why I felt particularly close to my grandmother. At any rate, I went to see her one afternoon when I was barely out of grammar school. An uncle dropped in to discuss with her his views of business conditions in the year ahead and how this might affect the stocks she owned. A whole new world opened up to me. By saving some money, I had the right to buy a share in the future profits of any one I might choose among hundreds of the most important business enterprises of the country. If I chose correctly, these profits could be truly exciting. I thought the whole subject of judging what makes a business grow an intriguing one, and here was a game that if I learned to play it properly would by comparison make any other with which I was familiar seem drab, meaningless, and unexciting. When my uncle left, my grandmother turned to me and said how sorry she was that he happened to come in when I was there, forcing her to spend time on matters which could not possibly interest me. I told her that, to the contrary, the hour he spent with her had seemed like 10 minutes and that I had just heard something that interested me tremendously. Years later, I was to realize how very few were the shares she owned and how extremely superficial were the comments I heard that day, but the interest that was kindled by that conversation has continued all during my life. With this degree of interest and in a period when most businesses were far less concerned with the legal hazards of dealing with minors than is the case today, I was able to make a few dollars for myself during the roaring bull market of the middle 1920s. I was strongly discouraged from this, however, by my physician father, who felt that it would simply teach me gambling habits. This was unlikely, as I am not by nature inclined to take chances merely for the sake of taking chances, which is the nature of gambling. On the other hand, as I look back upon it, my tiny-scale stock activities of that period taught me almost nothing of any great value so far as investment policies were concerned. Formative experiences. Before the great bull market of the 1920s was to come to its crashing end, I did have an experience, however, that was to teach me much of real importance for use in the years ahead. In the 1927-28 academic year, I was enrolled as a first-year student in Stanford University's then fledgling Graduate School of Business. 20% of that year's course, that is 1 day a week, was devoted to visiting some of the largest business enterprises in the San Francisco Bay Area. Professor Boris Emmett, who conducted this activity, had not been given this responsibility because of the usual academic background. In those days, the large mail-order companies obtained a significant part of their merchandise through contracts with suppliers whose sole customer was one or the other of these firms. These contracts frequently were so hard on the manufacturer and afforded him so little profit margin that from time to time a manufacturer would find himself in severe financial difficulty. It was not in the interest of the mail-order houses to see their vendors fail. Professor Emmett had for some years been the expert employed by one such mail-order firm with the job of salvaging these faltering companies when they had been squeezed too tightly. As a result, he knew a great deal about management. One of the rules under which this course was conducted was that we would visit no company that would just take us through the plan. After seeing the wheels go around, the management had to be willing to sit down with us so that, under the very shrewd questioning of our professor, we could learn something of what the strengths and weaknesses of the business really were. I recognized that this was a learning opportunity of just the type that I was seeking. I was able to jockey myself into a position to take particular advantage of it. In that day, over a half-century ago, when the ratio of automobiles to people was tremendously lower than it is today, Professor Emmett did not have a car. I did. I offered to drive him to these various plants. I did not learn much from him on the way over. However, each week on the way back to Stanford, I would hear comments of what he really thought of that particular company. This provided me with one of the most valuable learning experiences I have ever been privileged to enjoy. Also, on one of these trips I formed a specific conviction that was to prove of tremendous dollar value to me a few years in the future. It was actually to lay the foundation for my business. One week we visited not one but two manufacturing plants that were located next door to each other in San Jose. One was the John Bean Spray Pump Company, the world leaders in the manufacture of the type of pumps that were used to spray insecticides on orchards to combat natural pests. The other was the Anderson Barngrover Manufacturing Company, also world leaders, but in the field of equipment used by fruit canneries. In the 1920s, the concept of a growth company had not yet been verbalized by the financial community. However, as I somewhat awkwardly worded it to Professor Emmett, I thought that those two companies had probabilities of growing very much beyond their present size to a degree that I had seen in no other company we had visited. He agreed with me. Also, through spending part of the time on these automobile trips by asking Professor Emmett about his previous business experiences, I learned something else that was to stand me in good stead in the years ahead. This was the extreme importance of selling in order to have a healthy business. A company might be an extremely efficient manufacturer, or an inventor might have a product with breathtaking possibilities, but this was never enough for a healthy business. Unless that business contained people capable of convincing others as to the worth of their product, such a business would never really control its own destiny. It was later that I was to build on this base to conclude that even a strong sales arm is not enough. For a company to be a truly worthwhile investment, it must not only be able to sell its products, but also be able to appraise changing needs and desires of its customers, in other words, to master all that is implied in a true concept of marketing. First lessons in the School of Experience. As the summer of 1928 approached and my first year in the business school came to an end, an opportunity arose which seemed to me too good to pass up. In contrast to the hundreds of students that are enrolled each year in the school today, my class, being only the third in the graduate school's history, contained 19 students. The graduating class 1 year ahead of me contained only 9. Just 2 of these 9 were trained in finance. In that day of great stock market ferment, both were snapped up by New York-based investment trusts. At the last minute, an independent San Francisco bank, which years later was acquired by the Crocker National Bank of that city, sent down to the school a request for a graduate trained in investments. The school was anxious not to pass up this opportunity because if their representative merited the approval of the bank, it could be the forerunner of many opportunities for placing future graduates in the years to come. However, they had no graduate to send. It was not easy to do, but when I heard of this opportunity, I finally persuaded the school to send me with the thought that if I were to make good, I would stay there. If I could not fill the job, I would come back and take second-year courses, with the bank realizing that the school had made no pretense of sending them a completely trained student. Security analysts in those pre-crash days were called statisticians. It was 3 successive years of sensationally falling stock prices that were to occur just a short time ahead that caused the work of Wall Street's statisticians to fall into such disrepute that the name was changed to security analysts. I found that I was to be the statistician for the investment banking end of the bank. In those days, there was no legal barrier to banks being in the brokerage or investment banking business. The work I was assigned to do was extremely simple. In my opinion, it was also intellectually dishonest. The investment arm of the bank was chiefly engaged in selling high-interest rate, new issues of bonds on which they made quite sizable commissions as part of underwriting syndicates. No attempt was made to evaluate the quality of these bonds or any stocks they sold, but rather in that day of a seller's market they gratefully accepted any part of a syndicate offered them by their New York associates or by the large investment banking houses. Then the security salesman for the bank would portray to their customers that they had a statistical department capable of surveying those customers' holdings and issuing to them a report on each security handled. What was actually done in those security analyses was to look up the data on a particular company in one of the established manuals of the day, such as Moody's or Standard Statistics. Then someone like myself, with no further knowledge than what was reported in that manual, would simply paraphrase the wording of the manual to write his own report. Any company that was doing a large volume of sales was invariably reported as well managed just because it was big. I was under no direct orders to recommend that customers switch some of the securities I analyzed into whatever security the bank was attempting to sell at the moment, but the whole atmosphere was one of encouraging this type of analysis. Building the basics. It was not very long before the superficiality of the whole procedure caused me to feel that there must be a better way to do this. I was extremely fortunate in having an immediate boss who completely understood why I was concerned and granted me the time to make an experiment which I proposed to him. At that time, in the fall of 1928, there was a great deal of speculative interest in radio stocks. I introduced myself as a representative of the investment arm of the bank to the buyers of the radio department of several retail establishments in San Francisco. I asked them their opinions of the 3 major competitors in this industry. I was given surprisingly similar opinions from each of them. In particular, I learned a great deal from one man who was himself an engineer and who had worked for one of these companies. One company, Philco, which from my standpoint unfortunately was privately owned so that it represented no stock market opportunity, had developed models which had a special market appeal. As a result, they were getting market share at a beautiful profit to themselves because they were highly efficient manufacturers. RCA was just about holding its own market share, whereas another company, which was a stock market favorite of the day, was slipping drastically and showing signs of getting into trouble. None of this was the direct business of the bank, for it was not handling radio stocks. Nevertheless, an evaluative report seemed likely to help me considerably within the bank because many key bank officers who would see it were personally involved in speculation in these issues. Nowhere in material from Wall Street firms who were talking about these hot radio issues could I find a single word about the troubles that were obviously developing for the speculative favorite. In the ensuing 12 months, as the stock market continued on its reckless but merry way with most stocks climbing to new highs, I noticed with increasing interest how the stock I had singled out for trouble was sagging further and further in that rising market. It was my first lesson in what later was to become part of my basic investment philosophy. Reading the printed financial records about a company is never enough to justify an investment. One of the major steps in prudent investment must be to find out about a company's affairs from those who have some direct familiarity with them. At this early point, however, I had not achieved the next logical step in this type of reasoning. It is also necessary to learn as much as possible about the people who are running a company under investment considerations, either by getting to know those people yourself or by finding someone in whom you have confidence who knows them well. As 1929 started to unfold, I became more and more convinced of the unsoundness of the wild boom that seemed to be continuing. Stocks continued climbing to ever higher prices on the amazing theory that we were in a new era. Therefore, in the future, year after year of advancing per-share earnings could be taken as a matter of course. Yet as I tried to appraise the outlook for America's basic industries, I saw a number of them with supply-demand problems that seemed to me to indicate their outlook was getting rather wobbly. In August of 1929, I issued another special report to the officers of the bank. I predicted that the next 6 months would see the beginning of the greatest bear market in a quarter of a century. It would be very satisfying to my ego if at this point I could alter drastically the tale of just what happened and leave the impression that, having been exactly right in my forecasting, I then profited greatly from all this wisdom. The facts were quite to the contrary. Even though I felt strongly that the whole stock market was too high in those dangerous days of 1929, I was nevertheless entrapped by the lure of the market. This caused me to look around to find a few stocks that were still cheap and were worthwhile investments because they had not gone up yet. As a result of the small profits from the tiny amount of stock transactions a few years back and the saving of a good part of my salary plus some money I had earned in college, I managed to scrape together several $1,000s as 1929 went along. I divided this almost equally among 3 stocks which, in my ignorance, I thought were still undervalued in that overpriced market. One was a leading locomotive company with a still quite low price-earnings ratio. With railroad equipment being one of the most cyclical of all industries, it takes very little imagination to see what was to happen to that company's sales and profits in the business depression that was about to engulf us. The other 2 were a local billboard company and a local taxicab company also selling at very low price-earnings ratios. In spite of my success in ferreting out what was going to happen to the radio stocks, I just did not have the sense to start making similar inquiries from people who knew about these 2 local enterprises, even though obtaining such information or even getting to meet the people who ran these businesses would have been relatively simple since they were close at hand. As the depression increased, I learned rather vividly why these companies had been selling at such low price-earnings ratios. By 1932, only a tiny percentage of my original investment was represented by the market value of the shares in these companies. The Great Bear Market. Fortunately for my future well-being, I have an intense dislike for losing money. I have always believed that the chief difference between a fool and a wise man is that the wise man learns from his mistakes while the fool never does. The corollary of this is that it behooved me to go over my mistakes pretty carefully and not to repeat them again. My approach to investing expanded as I learned from my 1929 mistakes. I learned that while a stock could be attractive when it had a low price-earnings ratio, a low price-earnings ratio by itself guaranteed nothing and was apt to be a warning indicator of a degree of weakness in the company. I began realizing that, all the then current Wall Street opinion to the contrary, what really counts in determining whether a stock is cheap or overpriced is not its ratio to the current year's earnings, but its ratio to the earnings a few years ahead. If I could build up in myself the ability to determine within fairly broad limits what those earnings might be a few years from now, I would have unlocked the key both to avoiding losses and to making magnificent profits. In addition to learning that a low price-earnings ratio was just as apt to be a sign that a stock was an investment trap as that it was a bargain, acute awareness of my miserable investment performances during the Great Bear Market made me vividly aware of something of possibly even greater importance. I had been spectacularly right in my timing of when the bull market bubble was about to burst and almost right in judging the full force of what was to happen. Yet except for a possible small boost in my reputation among a very small circle of people, this had done me no good whatsoever. From then on, I was to realize that all the correct reasoning about an investment policy or about the desirability or purchase or sale of any particular stock did not have the least bit of value until it was translated into action through the completion of specific transactions. A chance to do my thing. In the spring of 1930, I made a change of employers. I only mention this because it triggered the events that were to cause the emergence of the investment philosophy that has guided me since that time. A regional brokerage firm came to me and made me a salary offer which, at age 22 and for that time and place, I found quite difficult to refuse. Furthermore, they offered me a vastly more appealing work assignment than the dissatisfying experience as a statistician in the investment banking arm of the bank. With no assigned duties whatsoever, I was to be free to devote my time to finding individual stocks which I thought were particularly suitable candidates for either purchase or sale because of their characteristics. I was then to write reports on my conclusions to circulate among the brokers employed by this firm to help them stimulate business that would be profitable for their clients. This offer came to me just after Herbert Hoover had made his famous "prosperity is just around the corner" statement. Several partners of the firm involved implicitly believed this. As a result of the 1929 crash, their total payroll had dropped from 125 employees to 75. They told me that if I accepted their offer, I would be number 76. I was just as bearish at the time as they were bullish. I felt sure the bear market was a long way from over. I told them that I would come on one condition. While they were free to fire me at any time if they did not like the quality of my work, lack of seniority must be no influence whatsoever if adverse financial markets forced them to make further reduction in payroll. They agreed to this provision. From disaster, opportunity springs. As employers, I could not have asked for nicer people. In the ensuing 8 months, I had one of the most valuable business educational experiences of my life. I saw at first-hand example after example of how the investment business should not be conducted. As 1930 unfolded and stocks once again continued on what seemed like an almost endless decline, my employer's position got more and more precarious. Then, just before Christmas of 1930, we who had so far survived the economic holocaust witnessed the grim picture of the whole firm being suspended from the San Francisco Stock Exchange for insolvency. This grim news for my associates was to prove one of the most fortunate business developments, if not the most fortunate, of my life. For some time I had had vague plans that when prosperity returned, I would start my own business by charging clients a fee for managing their investments. I am purposely using this roundabout way to describe the activities of an investment counselor or an investment advisor because in those days neither of these terms had yet been used. However, with almost everyone in the financial business retrenching during that gloomy January of 1931, the only security industry job I could find was a purely clerical and, to me, a quite unattractive one. If I had properly analyzed the situation, I would have realized that this was exactly the right time to start a new business of the kind I had in mind. I was to find that there were 2 reasons for this. One was that, after almost 2 years of the most severe bear market this nation had ever seen, nearly everyone was so dissatisfied with their existing brokerage connections that they were in the mood to listen even to someone both young and advocating a radically different approach to the handling of their investments as was I. Also, as the economy reached its depths in 1932, many key businessmen had so little to do in pursuing their own affairs that they had the time to see someone who was calling on them. In more normal times, I would never have gotten by their secretaries. One of the most worthwhile clients of my entire business career, and a man whose family's investments I still handle, was a typical example of this. Some years afterwards he told me that on the day I called he had had almost nothing to do and had already finished reading the sports section of the newspaper. So, when my name and purpose were told him by his secretary, he thought, listening to this guy will at least occupy my time. He confessed, if you had come to see me a year or so later, you never would have gotten into my office. A foundation is formed. All this was to result in several years of very hard work in a tiny office with low overhead. With no windows and merely glass partitions to serve as 2 of the walls, my total floor space was little larger than that needed to jam together a desk, my chair, and 1 other chair. For this, together with free local telephone service and a reasonable amount of secretarial help from the secretary receptionist of the gentleman from whom I leased the space, I paid the princely sum of $25 per month. My only other expenses were stationery, postage, and a very occasional long-distance call. The account book still in my possession provides an indication of how difficult it really was to start a new business in 1932. After very long hours of work over and above this overhead, I made a net profit averaging $2.99 per month for that year. In the still difficult year of 1933, I did a trifle better, showing an improvement of just under 1,000% and average monthly earnings of just over $29. This possibly was about what I would have made as a newsboy selling papers on the street. Yet in what those years were to bring me in the future, they were 2 of the most profitable years of my life. They provided me with the foundation for an extremely profitable business and with a group of highly loyal clients by 1935. It would be nice if I could claim that it was brilliant thinking on my part that caused me to start my business when I did rather than waiting until better times were to arrive. Actually, it was the unattractiveness of the only job that seemed open to me that pushed me into it.